Greetings, Ecotopians. Today we're studying ecological succession and disturbance. And I just have to say, every time I put these lectures together, I think, oh, it's only a couple of words, 5 or 6 words, no big deal. We'll get through this in 5 or 10 minutes, but it never seems to happen because I just find this stuff so interesting and there's so much to say about it. So forgive me if I drone on too long. I do the best I can. I am using in this background of today's lecture a picture of sand dunes in the coastal strand not too far away from Arcata. And this is a great place to study ecological succession and disturbance, which I urge you to do soon. It's actually part of one of the assignments that you have, which is to visit a local community, and this is a community in which ecological succession and disturbance is very important and very active and very evident. And so hopefully by the end of this lecture you will understand exactly what I mean by that, and you will go there and you will observe it. Observe ecological succession and disturbance actually happening. So let's get our definitions down. Ecological succession is, according to Wikipedia, the process of change in species structure of an ecological community over time. So it's important, really, I think, to pay attention to all the words. It's a process. It's a thing that happens and includes change in species structure. And what species structure means is the number of species in an ecological community over time. So you already know what a community is, populations of different species associating with each other in a place. So now we have change in species structures, a change in community over time. So that's what ecological succession is, and we'll be taking a pretty close look at it. I wanted to distinguish primary succession and secondary succession by telling you a little story. Some years ago I was in Arizona in the Red Rock country on Navajo Indian land, and they have the most amazing rock formations there, composed of it's sedimentary rock, it's sandstone, and oh my god, it looks exactly like frozen sand dunes. Basically that's what it is, just not frozen. And you can walk over this, and it's an entirely barren landscape. I thought I was crossing this land and I saw a little tiny blotch of orange, and I went and I looked at it, and it wasn't this lichen, but it was another one. I did have a picture of it, but I lost it, so I'm using this one. Anyway, I had to stop and look at this lichen and just try to understand it for a little while. It's Arizona. It's hot as hell in summertime. It's cold as anything in wintertime. And yet this little organism sits there splat flat on a rock for its entire life, for years and years. You try living on a piece of sandstone for 15 minutes in the Arizona sun, see how long you last. So to me, this lichen was, I don't know, a miracle, fantastic, just inspiring. And, sorry, it's an example of primary succession. So how is that an example of primary succession? Succession being a change in species composition over time, primary being the very first community, the very first organisms that show up on barren rock. So that happens, and after a while there's more of them, and they change the very environment they found when they arrived there. We've talked about chemical weathering. I've said briefly that lichens exude acids, lichenic acids. They will weather the rock. The rock weathers on its own from other reasons. But as living things begin to accrete upon the rock, they change it. They turn it into soil. They gather dust. They die, and they leave parts of their biomass behind, which is food for decomposers, and so on and so forth. And so over time, if left alone, the community will change. So primary succession begins with rocks and then proceeds from there. I'll come back to secondary succession in a moment. So the definition: primary succession is the initiation of community beginning with 0 species and its change over time. That's primary succession. So over time, this is not the same place, it's another place, but it's a place that's very young in terms of its successional stage. And you can see the species here. There's some grasses, or those actually might be orchids. Again, this is Ecuador. And here's some primitive plant, and here's some other primitive plants, some grasses, maybe some lichens. Not many shrubs and trees, but you can imagine that as these other guys start growing up, they will capture soil that comes in. They will hold that soil with their roots. They will capture energy, and that energy is now locked up in biomass and will be pumped into the roots, where it will fertilize essentially a soil community that is also undergoing succession. And then over time, maybe some bush seed lands here from a bird poop, and it grows, and now we have bushes, and then soon we have trees, and so the community changes over time. And here's a little cartoon that shows that. I'll just read the text first and we'll talk about the picture. Because species interact with each other and with the rest of the environment, communities change over time. And here's ecological succession, with time starting from annual plants on barren rock, and lichens and mosses and some other stuff. It's not a very good cartoon. And then we have some other guys coming in, then we have some shrubs, and then we have some trees, and then some bigger trees. So this is a fair cartoon of ecological succession. You notice that as time goes on, in the end, we get hardwood trees, and I'm like, look around you in this part of the world. No, with a long time, you don't get hardwood trees, you get redwood trees. In fact, you get hardwood trees earlier, like alder, then you get redwoods. But I hope you get the point. It's a cartoon, and it's not meant to represent reality everywhere on the planet. But what is good is that in primary succession, you get stuff like this, and over time the community changes very often, but not always, very often into a forested community. So primary succession starts here. I just wanted to emphasize that it starts on barren rock. So the question is, well, cool, that's neat. Is there an end point to succession? If time went on, would we get bigger and bigger trees until we had something more massive than the universe? Well, no, that doesn't happen. And you may have heard of the climax forest being, I guess, some magical community that is the end point of all succession. And for many years, ecologists taught of the climax forest, but things have changed in the ecological world, and pretty much ecologists don't buy this concept of the climax forest, that in the end you get a stable community of a certain composition. And so the question is, well, why not? And this is why not. Whoops. Oh, sorry. I'll tell you why not in a sec. So here is our representation of, is this not a climax forest? Has this forest just not been left alone for thousands of years until we have this virgin redwood forest? When you think about it, the redwood species is tens of millions of years old, and it's very likely that for tens of millions of years this particular bit of ground has been composed of redwood forests, that they've been here even despite all the changes in climate over millions of years. Is possible. So is this not a climax forest? Ecologists would say no, not really, because even this forest faces disturbances. Shit happens. Here is just an example of some major shit happening. I won't call it, I hope I haven't offended you, but I figured if Forrest Gump can say it, I can say it in my videos. It's rated, this class is rated PG. Anyway, so here's some examples of some major disturbances. Here's a clear cut. Here is the most recent terrible landslide in Oso, Washington. I hope you've heard about that. It's really tragic. So landslides, mass wasting they call it. Logging is a disturbance. Flooding can be a disturbance as the water drowns things and washes away soil and organisms. And fire too is a big disturbance that we'll be talking about in more detail in a sec. So all of these change community composition, but not in the same way as succession does, but in the opposite direction. So here's a definition of an ecological disturbance. An ecological disturbance is a temporary change in average environmental conditions that causes a pronounced change in an ecosystem. Change? What kind of change? Well, it's vague. It could be any kind of a change. It could be a change in the energy captured by photosynthesis. It could be a change in nutrient cycling. Maybe nutrients are lost. It could be a change in the community composition. Did numbers of species change, or the numbers may stay the same, but the composition changes? So I just wanted to point out this picture here. It's a terrible picture from my cell phone. I went on a very long walk in an old-growth redwood forest, something that I hope you do soon and frequently, because it is a really profoundly moving experience, not just to go into a virgin forest, but to spend a lot of time in it. And I spent a lot of time in the forest recently and had a great time, and I took this picture. And what it is a picture of, I need to explain because of the poor picture quality. This is a big old stump, and it has fire scars on the inside, which may have both gotten there after the tree died or even before it died. If you look around in these forests, you see lots and lots of scars on living trees, and this is one of its daughter trees. So this was a big old tree that very likely gave rise to this from a root sprout, this big old guy, who in turn has fire damage. So while it's been alive, it's been damaged by fires, and in turn this organism has given rise to a new sapling. So we have yet a new sapling. And when you think about it, that's cool, because how old is this tree? Well, this tree is not very old. And this tree is probably 1,000 years old. And this tree was probably a couple thousand years old. But it's all the same organism. And so it's possible, and who knows where this tree came from. Did it sprout from a seed, or did it arise from some other organism? In any case, this organism has been here for a long time. And the concept of the climax forest is that there's no more disturbance. It's achieved a stable state. And it's not true, I guess they would say, that even this old ancient forest is totally stable. Shit happens. The trees fall down. Fires come through. Diseases come through and kill off trees. And so on a small scale, this old forest is always being disturbed. A windstorm comes through and knocks things down, knocks a tree down, which hits another tree down. Now we have an opening and other species come in. So I'm sort of doing two things here. One is emphasizing the term ecological disturbance, that it happens, and also dispelling the idea of the climax forest. Okay, so change is constant. That is a bit of wisdom that our elders have taught us, and also it's something that we're now applying to our understanding of the natural world, that change is constant. Okay. So let's take a little bit of closer look at fire, because it's really very important to many ecosystems on the planet, and our ecosystem in particular. You have probably heard of news reports of these massive fires that happen every summer, sometimes even in wintertime, and it's a real problem in North America. For a number of reasons, and I'm not going to go into great detail on this because it's goes beyond the purpose of this course, but since fire is important in redwood ecosystems, I need to talk about it. The United States has been suppressing fires for over 100 years. That is, when forests begin to burn, we think that's bad, and so we go and we put the fires out. And unfortunately, that's not a natural thing, because it turns out that fires are actually pretty common in forests. That is, they happen naturally and frequently. And when they happen frequently, they don't kill the trees. When they happen, not frequently, when there hasn't been a fire recently, a lot of fuel builds up in the forest. The trees grow, they're not burned, they keep growing, their babies grow, it gets very crowded and dense, and there's lots of kindling, and when it burns, the fire jumps up into the crown and it kills the tree. all the trees in the forest, setting the stage all the way back almost to primary succession. The ground here is basically going to be sterilized. There's nothing there. It's as good as rock. And so the successional clock is being set way back when fires have been suppressed for a long period of time. We have a centuries of legacy in American forests of fire suppression, and we're in a very difficult situation now with how to manage that. But again, if the fires happen more frequently, then there's not so much kindling built up on the forest floor, so when the fires come, it doesn't climb up into the tree and kill off the trees. This is an ecological disturbance, a low intensity ground fire, but it's not as big a disturbance as a high intensity crown fire. Okay, I actually do want you to know these terms: high intensity crown fire and low intensity ground fire, because it's really important that you understand this part of fire. It's important to redwood ecosystems. Also, not just redwood ecosystems, not even this kind of habitat. So this is called oak savanna, or more generally savanna. Savanna is a combination grassland with isolated trees scattered about, and it's found on all continents except for Antarctica, as far as I know, in a transition zone from prairie to forested. So if this habitat were drier, the trees could not grow. No trees could grow, and we'd have a grassland, and if it got even drier, we'd have desert. If it were more moist, we would get a closed canopy forest. But in the border between prairie and forest, we tend to find these savannas, and we have them here in our neighborhood. As you go inland, as you get higher in the mountains outside of the redwood zones, you find savanna. And one of the things that maintains a savanna as a savanna are frequent fires, which used to happen on their own to a certain extent by lightning strikes, and they would burn frequently. But in our area, and in fact much of North America, and I would hazard to guess in many other parts of the world, these fires have been started by humans for thousands of years as a way of managing their ecosystem. The Native Americans in our neighborhood, the Yuroks, the Karoks, the Wiots, and others, are known to have set fires regularly to manage their ecosystems as an oak savanna or as a prairie in some cases, as I'll show you soon. Why do that? For a number of reasons. It encourages the growth of plants that are useful to them. It encourages the growth of plants that are useful to their game, so for deer, and maybe for other reasons that I'm not familiar with. So this too has become a problem with the suppression of the Native Americans and their ways of life, their habits, and with fire suppression. What happens in our area is that savanna, in the absence of fire, tends to give rise to Douglas fir, which comes in, overshadows the oaks, and the oaks die off, and now we have a dense growth of Douglas fir, which is a completely different kind of community. So we'll talk more about savanna a bit in an upcoming lecture having to do with communities in our area, specific communities. So fire as a disturbance to ecosystems and communities. Just a Google Earth image, maybe some of you guys recognize this place. This is the prairie of Prairie Creek Redwoods. And I think this is park headquarters, national park headquarters up here, and a campground or picnic area over here. And it's a big flat area, and very frequently you can see Roosevelt elk in this area. And they say in their brochures that this was an area that was burned by the Native Americans back in the day, and it kept open for that because of the burning. Otherwise, without that burning, this would be an old growth redwood forest. Okay, so this has been kept open by human activities and still is. I don't know if they still set fires here, or if they just drive their lawnmower over it. I have no idea. But certainly it's being maintained by the National Park Service as a prairie. Otherwise, succession would occur and we would get a forest. Okay, so coming back to our cartoon, we talked about primary succession being what happens here, but secondary succession begins anywhere else following an ecological disturbance. So take any stage in succession, add a disturbance to it, and you change the community back to some former composition, and then we get what's called secondary succession. Okay, so if someone's going to talk about succession, you want them to tell you, are you talking about primary succession or secondary succession? And if you're talking about secondary succession, tell me where it started out with before the disturbance, tell me what the disturbance was, and tell me how far back the disturbance took you, to what period in secondary succession. Okay. So now I just wanted to talk about a few other kinds of ecological disturbances, and one of my favorites to think about is invasive species as an ecological disturbance. Invasive species may or may not be an ecological disturbance. Let's think about that. And let me just describe these two pictures. First of all, this picture I got emailed. It was a mass email to, I think, faculty here at Humboldt State, and it was by someone in history or anthropology who is, or maybe it was an ethnobotanist, who is trying to figure out when English ivy arrived in Humboldt County. And this picture, I'm sorry, I've forgotten the year. I think it comes with a date and the word Wichipec in it, which is a town on the Klamath River, I think. And it shows a Native American, apparently a Native American woman and her kids, and this man who I don't know if he's, what his race or ethnicity is. Is he a Native American or a Caucasian? I don't know. But there was the person who's doing the historical research wanted to know, does anybody recognize these people so we can get a better date on when this English ivy came in. What does this have to do with invasive species? Well, English ivy is a non-native species that thrives in our neck of the woods. It thrives to the extent that it can cover other plants and wipe them out. That is a change in community composition. That's a change in species structure. That is a disturbance. Whether it's temporary or not, that's another question. What is temporary? Does it mean a matter of days, minutes, hours, years? How many years? Decades? Hundreds of years? When I was a kid, the gypsy moth was introduced into New England, and it became invasive. That is, it came, it was established, and then it exploded in population numbers, and it stripped the leaves off of every tree in the forest, and it was unbelievable. It looked like winter in summertime in terms of the canopy being gone. And as they were doing this, the millions of gypsy moth caterpillars in the trees would eat the leaves, and then they'd poop. And if there wasn't any wind and you just listened, it sounded like rain. And we thought the apocalypse had arrived, that these bugs were going to wipe out everything and our forest would be gone. But something happened, and after some years, the gypsy moth, maybe it didn't disappear, but it wasn't so bad. The trees were no longer being denuded. And so in that case, the disturbance, it was an ecological disturbance. There was a temporary aspect to it. What's going to happen to English ivy? Will it take over the world and wipe out all the forests that we know of? Or will it too come under control? We'll have to wait and see. But in the meantime, just for casual conversation, we're going to call it an ecological disturbance. Here's another one, another invasive species as an ecological disturbance, European beach grass. As I mentioned, we will be talking about the coastal strand, that is the beach and the sand dunes and the habitats associated with it, or the communities associated with it. And you will see European beach grass, which is non-native. It was planted to stabilize sand dunes, and it does a great job at that. It really stabilizes the sand dunes. It grows great on our sand dunes. In fact, it grows so great, it outcompetes all the native vegetation in the area and wipes them out. So that's a good example of a disturbance, I guess. It may be permanent. I don't have much hope for European beach grass ever disappearing. I think it's here to stay. Okay, so moving on from invasive species, I just want to mention farming. One of my favorite subjects is farming. I love to farm and garden. And yet I understand that farming and gardening is a kind of ecological disturbance. When you go out there and you till your garden, you're basically killing all the species there. Right? You're just killing all the weeds, and probably you're killing a lot of earthworms and snails and on, and making a great place to grow things because there's no other species there. So that is an ecological disturbance, a temporary change in the community structure. Farming is a huge ecological disturbance. Changes the amount of light being captured, the amount of energy going into an ecosystem, the cycling of nutrients, the species composition, everything. Agriculture is a huge ecological disturbance. Well, yeah, what about us? Are we an ecological disturbance? I think you'd have to say yes. You might quibble over that because you might say, well, maybe we're temporary. We will come and we will go and everything will go back to the way it was. You might say, well, who are you talking about, we? If you're a Native American, you might definitely see the invasion of Europeans as an ecological disturbance, whereas you might think that the Native Americans are not an ecological disturbance because they've been here since the beginning of time. Well, maybe the anthropologists in Western science might say, well, Native Americans have been here for at least 14,000 years or more, so does that mean they're temporary? I don't think so. In any case, the effect of Native Americans on the ecosystems in our area cannot compare to the ecological disturbance caused by the European arrival. So that's pretty obvious. So I would say, yeah, you could make a really good argument that we are an ecological disturbance throughout North America and everywhere else our populations have arrived and exploded. Okay, so I'm concluding now. This is an aerial picture of Oric, salmon, let's see, Redwood Creek and the mouth of Redwood Creek into our Pacific Ocean, and Oric is in the distance with Redwood National Park in the background. And I just wanted to say that it can be a very difficult thing to be an ecologist, because instead of seeing a view like this as almost everyone else views it, as stunningly beautiful, instead we see it as a world that's been scarred. We see agricultural land here, which is all kept in a constant state of ecological disturbance for agricultural purposes. We see a river here that used to flow freely back and forth here and support all kinds of crazy wildlife, but is now kept in bounds by this dike the Army Corps of Engineers built and I presume maintains. We see forests here. Yay, a whole bunch of it has been preserved. It is intact virgin redwood forest, but we also see a lot of areas that have been logged and in various states of succession. We see succession and disturbance and succession wherever we look. Disturbance and succession caused mainly by the hand of man when you see it. So it's a difficult thing being an ecologist, but don't feel sorry for me. I get by pretty good. So in conclusion, let's look at our redwood forest, and I want to talk about what we see here in terms of what we've learned. So what we see here, first of all, may be good habitat for redwoods and for sword ferns, great habitat. We see a community of organisms that live together, and many are unseen. We see a place where energy is being captured by plants and funneled into the community via herbivores and decomposers. We see a place where nutrients are cycling tightly among the different organisms. We know that this community here is part of a larger network of communities called an ecosystem. And we know now that this is not an unchanging environment, that we can expect change to happen because change always happens. We can even name some ways that change will happen. These trees bear fire scars, evidence that fires have come through and disturbed the community, and that succession has happened since the last fire, and the fire will come back, and other things will too. So in the future, coming up soon, we'll be taking a closer look at the specific communities in the redwood ecosystem. Not just old growth redwood, but we will take a closer look at old growth redwood, but some of the other common communities that we have here. Okay, thank you. Take care.